So premarital sex seems to be a huge challenge among single Muslims. There's actually been a couple of studies that I've been looking at, the Family and Youth Institute and a researcher, Dr. Sobia out of Canada. Their surveys found that 50 to 60% of young Muslims are engaging in some sort of premarital sexual activity. So the question becomes, we know that premarital sex has regulations within Islam, and Muslims are struggling with following through with this guideline. And what I'm finding is there's so many reasons why. And before we get into that, maybe wanting to ask you, I'm sure you've come across this topic of young Muslims struggling with abstinence before marriage.
Yeah, I mean, those statistics are shocking. I've heard them before from you, but every time I hear them, it still sort of shocks me. And of course, the Sharia is very clear, and I guess one would also say strict when it comes to gender relations, exactly for this reason. The whole idea about lowering the gaze. A lot of times people think it's a mechanical, I'm going to walk around, sort of with my eyes down, but it's much more than that. Lowering the gaze is a way to protect oneself from engaging in that. When God talks about illicit sexual relations, he says, وَلَا تَقْرَبُوا الزِّنَا, do not even come close to that act. In other words, the things that will lead to that act also are things that we shouldn't be doing, because unfortunately, once you go down that path, it's oftentimes very hard to come back and to hold yourself. So God, in a way, is looking out for us, or not in a way, God is looking out for us by giving us those parameters. And there is something about waiting. It's almost like a magic relationship, when somebody gets married and you find your partner. But I think part of the problem as well is that we've made marriage difficult. So it's not just lower your gaze and don't pay attention, and then you walk outside and then everything is just one big tribulation. It's also, what are we doing to help the marriage process and facilitate that? And that's, I think, where a lot of work needs to take place. How about
That's
you?
such an important point you bring up, that marriage has become so difficult. And I think some of it is our own doing. I work with young Muslims who are seeking a spouse, and they come with a checklist of items that they want their spouse to have, and a list of deal breakers. And the mahar is sometimes amounts of money or property that cannot be reached. And we are often making things difficult. And I often think, we've lost the tradition of marriage in terms of making it easy and simple and centering a lot in the process. We're kind of becoming materialistic. And then something else I found is that Muslims often don't know how to manage their sexual feelings. So let's say they're getting to know somebody. Obviously, they might feel some attraction. They might feel some desire towards that person. And I'm often working with Muslims on how to manage that. So, we don't want to repress the feelings and think that this is wrong and bad, because Allah created these feelings for marriage, and there's an abundant amount of blessings with marital intimacy. And young Muslims are asking, how do I manage these feelings? How do I not act on them? And like you said before in another video, we're inundated with sexual content around us. So some of it I see as, we know the guidelines, let's figure out ways to manage these feelings so that there's an outlet that's not sexual in nature. And I feel like that piece is sometimes missing in this work.
Yeah, you mentioned the checklist. It reminds me of when we buy something on Amazon. We're looking for the 5-star review, and we're looking for that perfect item, that bulletproof item. And I think what happens is, when we approach marriage with the checklist, we forget our own internal checklist, because the other person's obviously going to have a checklist. So where am I vis-a-vis the ideals that I care about in another person? Do I live up to those same ideals myself? And when the Prophet, peace be upon him, talked about marriage for both men and women, the standard that he put is good character and first principles. He didn't really put stock in the wealth and the beauty and the social connections, because those things can come and can go. And oftentimes will come and go multiple times throughout somebody's life. But the internal disposition of a person's character and their first principles, that's a foundational. It's impossible to separate a person from those things. That's what he said we should look at, peace be upon him. And I think that, I like you, and I get the checklist person, the mentality. That's another red flag for me. I said, okay, this person's, this is not, you're not buying something on Amazon. It's not going to work like that. It's going to be ebbs and flows. So We need to work on that, redefining the institution of marriage and lessening the burden to make it easier for people to get married.
Absolutely.